It seems like we're headed on a crash course for BYU and Iowa State to play in the Big 12 championship, but 14 other teams want to keep that from happening. Who's going to ruin it? This is a Locked On Big 12, Locked On Cougars crossover.
You are Locked On Big 12, your daily podcast on the Big 12 Conference. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Happy Tuesday, everybody. Welcome into a Locked On Big 12, Locked On Cougars crossover. I'm Drake Toll from America's #1 Big 12 podcast, Locked On Big 12. That's Jake Hatch from Locked On Cougars. Thank you for making our shows your first listen every single day. Off the top, who would destroy BYU's chances at a Big 12 title and Iowa State too? In the middle, what makes the Big 12 so special? Because it feels like everybody has come together this year in the perfect storm for the perfect conference to represent what American college football is all about. And then finally, is BYU the best new addition of the 8 to this conference? It's tough to argue for anybody else. If you hit subscribe, we get to keep our job. Not saying job security is low, but if you hit subscribe, it would be very, very helpful so that we stay in the driver's seat. Jake, off the top here, there are some other legitimate schools in the Big 12 conference when it comes to football, from Colorado to even Cincinnati, that pose a threat to BYU. But is there anybody you're as worried about as Iowa State, who BYU is on a crash course to meet in the Big 12 championship?
Quite frankly, no, because the simple fact of the matter is BYU superseded all expectations right now. And as you mentioned, they're in the driver's seat. If they keep winning, they're going to go to Arlington. And yeah, Iowa State's on kind of the other side. They don't play each other this year in the regular season. So yeah, it's a crash course with those two heading for a collision course in Arlington, Texas, which, let's be honest, Drake, I don't think anybody had those two picked as the title game favorites going into the year.
No, a team ranked outside of the top 10 in the preseason Big 12 and Iowa State, who many had in the 6, 7, 8 slot, are both undefeated in conference play. And honestly, from an EPA standpoint, from the standpoint of efficiency, both of these schools are the top in the country. It's not just the Big 12. Strength of record, BYU and Iowa State, top 5 in America per ESPN. They're showing it's not just a fluky conference deal, but both schools are legitimate. That begs the question, though, and I've learned, Jake, recently from BYU fans, they're always prepared for the worst-case scenario. It's always, all right, when is it going to strike midnight? When do we all come back to reality? With UCF or Arizona State on the road or Utah on the road coming up for BYU, who is the most dangerous team to ruin the Cougars' dream season?
It's the Utes. Sorry to say it, but here's the deal. I know that Utah is in all kinds of upheaval right now. Obviously, their quarterback, they had pinned their hopes on Cam Rising. He's done for the year. They just had their offensive coordinator step down.
Yeah.
There's a whole lot going on in Utah with regards to the Utes, but Drake, I've watched this rivalry game my entire life. When these two teams get together, weird, crazy things happen. And nothing against UCF, nothing against ASU, nothing against Houston. But the team that worries me the most about BYU, not even Kansas, like all of them, you can include all of them in that conversation. But it is absolutely the Utah Utes having to go to Rice-Eccles Stadium, even with all the upheaval going on up on the hill. I'm still absolutely petrified at the thought of BYU's dream season coming crashing down at the hands of the Utes.
When it comes to UCF this week specifically, is there a worry that's also, I don't want to say a trap game for BYU, but maybe that's the way to put it here? Does it feel like the Cougars are in a tough spot on the road against the Knights?
I don't even really consider it a trap game. I just consider the fact that BYU gave up 269 rushing yards to Oklahoma State last week. And oh, by the way, UCF runs it like an option team from the service academies. They average like 350 a game. And that's the concern I've got is BYU's rush defense got exposed in a big way by Oklahoma State. And if they don't fix that in a very short turnaround, they got 8 days to get ready for this game at UCF. But if they don't get it turned around quickly, yeah, you could be walking into Orlando, getting thumped, and then having to travel all the way home and spend 2 weeks stewing on that before you get back out on the field.
If I can give Jay Hill any sort of advice this week, it's that UCF will not run the football. Their quarterback last week, Ja'Curry Brown, 8 for 20, 62 yards. That was their entire pass game, though the ground game ran for 354 against Iowa State. I know the UCF game's not easy. You go on the road again against Utah. Let's look at those last three when we're talking BYU scheduled the rest of the way. Kansas at Arizona State, Houston. Those two home games, Kansas and Houston, very winnable. We know that. At Arizona State scares me now, Jake. How do BYU fans feel about it?
No, it's scary because I think when we were talking before the season, the whole conversation for BYU's flipped on its head because you and I talked in the summer. I thought 6-6 would have been a marvelous season.
Yes.
They flew right by that. And Arizona State was one of those teams going into the season. You're like, okay, that's when you need to get a win if you're going to get to 6 wins for BYU. Well, guess what? Arizona State, much like BYU, is a far better team than we all anticipated coming into this year. But even you mentioned the other two, speaking of Houston and Kansas, I mentioned one thing on the Kansas front. I know that Kansas is struggling mightily, but there's one ace up their sleeve that they have a guy that already knows everything about BYU and Jeff Grimes. Say what you will about his performance as offensive coordinator for Kansas this year. The one thing that he will bring into that game is an institutional knowledge of what BYU is all about because he helped build the offense that Aaron Roderick runs to this day for BYU. So that's the only concern I've got with Kansas is him being able to say, hey, this is what they're going to run. Here's how they're going to call it. Here's what they're going to do on that front. So there are trap elements to all of those games. And I know that BYU, their whole goal is to go week by week here, but they've got to be ready every single week because every one of these teams, as you mentioned, wants to upend them.
Kansas State, Cincinnati, Colorado, those teams don't exist the rest of the way for BYU, but they're in at least the conversation for a Big 12 championship berth. Did those teams scare you? Do you think if the Cougars got we'll start here. If the Cougars got a rematch with Kansas State, would it be a different game at a neutral site in Arlington?
Yeah, it would. Here's the thing. BYU won that game in the middle 8. And we talk about it all the time. And they turned it over and cashed those in for touchdowns. That was the term was used fluky by a lot of people, but BYU's proven that they can turn teams over and cash those in for touchdowns. But the way some of those turnovers came against Kansas State, that's a weirdly shaped ball that bounced a really unique way in favor of BYU that night. I do think it would be a different game. Yeah, there is some concern about Iowa State and a guy like Shedeur Sanders for Colorado that BYU could face in Arlington potentially. I do know this, Drake. Every one of those teams that doesn't face BYU right now, they want UCF to win on Saturday because that completely changes the calculus of how they get themselves to Arlington.
Colorado. Are you worried about a Colorado matchup if that is what happens in Arlington?
I think Jay Hill will be ready for Shedeur Sanders and Travis Hunter. I really do, because here's the deal. BYU has been so good overall defensively in terms of shutting down opposing teams' best options. And I think that if you could tell Jay Hill, hey, you have this team, they won a game the other week with minus 27 yards rushing. He's going to say, all right, well, I'll give him 100 yards rushing, but I'm going to make sure they only pass for like 150. He'll be ready for something like that.
Cincinnati, which BYU is very familiar with Cincinnati. Is there a worry that if you get the Bearcats in a Big 12 championship, that their mix of both the pass and run game could be dangerous against the Cougs?
I think it could. I'm not as concerned about Cincinnati because I just don't think the personnel for Cincinnati scares BYU as much as other personnel. Now, I'm saying that speaking of a BYU team, that if you look at the recruiting rankings, BYU is near the bottom in terms of, if you go by star ratings of their overall athletes on their team. But I look at Cincinnati and I would say that they're maybe the least concerning to me if I'm speaking from the BYU perspective. But you're right. They do have a nice mix of run, pass, and that could be an issue for BYU trying to slow down one of those two things, if not both.
The Godfather, Dante Corleone, will give anybody trouble when it comes to the Bearcats. That's a good mix of talking other Big 12 teams that will be a threat to BYU, who's obviously the biggest surprise in the conference, still undefeated. Coming up, what makes the Big 12 special? Because it's very apparent the Cougars have found a special home in this conference. This is a Locked On Big 12, Locked On Cougars crossover, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's show is brought to you by Roy. You know that Jake Retzlaff could transfer in the offseason? It's possible, right? But NIL is such a big part of the game that you can help sway players to stay at your school. So BYU fans, let's recognize our Roy Player of the Week, Jake Retzlaff. So far this season, we pulled over $20,000 to support players on Roy with the Roy app, ROY. You can directly support student athletes at your school, and you know where the support is going, where you get exclusive content, videos, updates after the season. And the best part, it's risk-free. If someone does transfer, you don't have to actually pay. This week, we're supporting Jake Retzlaff. I put $100 in to keep him at BYU. Even $10 make a difference. Remember, pay today, celebrate tomorrow. Your support means success for your entire team. Plus, don't miss out on Roy's giveaway. 2 tickets. You can get 2 tickets to a game in November. Just download Roy, create an account, and enter referral code Locked On. You're entered. Already on Roy, you can just enter Locked On and you're entered. Then no purchase necessary, void where prohibited. Download Roy now and join the NIL game with no subscriptions, no fees. Be sure to check us out on Instagram, Facebook, and X at Roy_return on you for more info. That is Roy. Visit Roy today to keep Jake Retzlaff at BYU. Jake Hatch of Locked On Cougars covering all things BYU. From the perspective of a university that was independent just 3 years ago, what makes, I'm going to leave it vague to start, what makes the Big 12 special?
The fact that BYU has been accepted by their peers in this conference, because here's the deal. I've been covering BYU for long enough, Drake. There was a institutional bias in the Pac-12, which BYU, if they had their druthers years ago, would have been in that conference. They would have loved to have been there because it's a West Coast-oriented league. Obviously, BYU has fans all over in that footprint, but the fact that they were shunned so hard and outright mocked by some of the fan bases and the schools in the Pac-12 pushed BYU the other direction. And the fact they've gone into the Big 12, they found like-minded schools like Baylor and TCU that are religious-minded schools, but also the rest of the schools in the conference have accepted BYU for what they are. The Cougars, they love being in this conference, and they are a proud member, and I don't think they have any intentions of jumping anytime soon because I think they're very, very content and happy where they're at.
Let me do something, and this is terrible of me to do. This is I'm scheming here. Do you feel as though an Arizona or a Utah, the new Pac-12 teams, are getting that same feeling out of the Big 12 when they're entering post being in a Power 5 conference?
I think Arizona is, because Arizona was so gung-ho about joining the league. Arizona State and Utah, not so much, because they were so reticent to make the move, but they realized that the writing was on the wall there and they made the jump. Colorado, I think, is more in the camp of an Arizona where they made the leap. They said, you know what? We're out. We're jumping. We're going back to our.
Might I interject? I think Jake, Colorado's only worried about Deion Sanders. You can put them whatever the league they want. Colorado is focused on one thing, and it's Deion Sanders.
Okay, fair point. Very fair point on that front. But yeah, I do think that the two schools, speaking of ASU and Utah, when they jumped into the league, it was simply because they realized they're on a sinking ship that was the Pac-12, and they needed to find a new home. Whereas Arizona, they were out there saying, "Yeah, we'll do this. We've got strong basketball. We'll fit right in with this." So yeah, I do think that there's a difference just in terms of the overall mindset of why they ended up joining the Big 12.
Do you think, Jake, that Utah fan, I'll ask JT Wistersill of Locked On Utes the same thing. Okay. Do you think that Utah fans, by and large, and you've dealt with Utah fans for a very long time, have come off the high horse and been a little more level-headed with their membership in the Big 12 after these last few weeks?
Yes, absolutely. They've been humbled. I work in sports radio here in Salt Lake City, and guess what? We talk about three main things on my sports radio show: the Utes, the Cougars, the Jazz. Those are the three things. Well, guess what? The Utes, they have been humbled by what's happened. Obviously, they've been in all kinds of upheaval. When you have your offensive coordinator step down, the quarterback you had pinned your college football playoff hopes end up injuring himself, and he's out for the entire season. It's been a really, really rough run for Utah of late, and I do think the fans have been humbled. I think they've realized maybe, just maybe, we weren't just going to roll through this conference like we thought initially.
BYU came in with UCF, Cincinnati, and Houston, and they have a different perspective coming from a conference. But does it feel like, from your perspective, it was kind of the perfect merge for those universities to come with BYU? I mean, those are the schools that BYU paired with to make it into this conference. Does it feel like those four belong in their own pod of, hey, guys, this makes sense for us to go here together?
I do think so. I think all of them are hungry to be a part of the Power 4 level. So they've kind of banded together. Now, have they played each other enough to really kind of build that bond? Maybe not so much so far, but I do know like an institutional level. So speaking of the university presidents, the ADs and the like, I'm sure all four of them are very happy to work with one another and say, you know what? We did a good thing by jumping into this league, and we're having a great time being here while we're here.
Jake, those matchups, BYU against Cincinnati or BYU against UCF, even BYU against Arizona or Arizona State, is that something you feel as though Brett Yormark should target every year to let these new schools play one another very consistently?
Absolutely. Because here's the deal. BYU and the Arizona schools, my grandfather he's been a BYU fan forever. And he remembers when ASU and Arizona were whack rivals of BYU. And he said there were some very, very good games in the 60s and 70s between those schools. And he wanted that back. And so I think that you have those ancestral rivalries that will be renewed with the Arizona schools. We mentioned the fact that UCF, Cincinnati, Houston, well, they're all kind of new to this league and trying to kind of find their footing and build new rivalries. Well, why not get them together and see what can come out of those matchups? Because you really don't know until you try.
In talking about the conference as it exists, we have to go back to the original 8 members as well, from TCU, West Virginia to Texas Tech and Baylor. Yeah. For a BYU, and I do believe you would answer this differently than a Utah fan. The Utah fan is probably still up in arms and trying to figure out their existence in the Big 12 conference as they come off the high horse. But for BYU, who came in so humble, what is your opinion of how the 8 teams have welcomed the Cougars and UCF, Cincinnati, the like, into this league?
It's been open arms. That's the thing about this is they welcomed BYU and they understood that BYU brought a brand name with them. They brought kind of that mountain time zone. Because remember, when BYU joined the league, they were out on an island on their own. The closest school to them, just in terms of sheer mileage, was Texas Tech, and it was over 1,000 miles away. So BYU brought a new element to this league. They opened up a new time window. Yes, now that you've added Utah and the Arizona schools in Colorado, that brings a whole new element in terms of the TV time window you can utilize. But BYU was welcomed with open arms because I think they understood BYU bought a brand name, brought literally a national, if not international following, because everybody knows that Cougar fans are all over the world and tuning in to what's going on with BYU. Your and my podcast can speak to that directly, just with the numbers that when you talk BYU, they get propped up from all over the place. But they've felt welcome with open arms, and it's been a really, really good reception so far.
Moving forward, what is it about the Big 12 that makes it distinct to you from the ACC, the SEC, the Big 10? Is there something that sets us apart in a way?
So far, it's the parity because, Baylor went and beat Texas Tech and beat the Doors. Yeah. I thought Baylor was left for dead. And I know that you have it. Baylor's near and dear to your heart. So the Bears, really, really cool to see that. But that shows you that on a week by week basis, this league's going to be topsy turvy. And Utah, I would have told you coming into this year, Drake, Utah was going to go to the Big 12 title game. I didn't know if they were going to finish first or second, but the way things have unfolded for Utah, absolutely astounding to me, because I think that team's got way too much talent to be performing at the level it's performing. But as you mentioned, there's a bunch of things going on apparently behind the scenes that have caused things to kind of fall apart. But the biggest thing is just overall as a league, this is going to be a league that on any given week, some team, let's say a Cincinnati, might go to an Iowa State and beat them, or a BYU could travel to a West Virginia as they did last year and get beat. That's the fun part about this, is you never quite know. You can have an idea of who you think might win on a given week, but never, like I said, I'll say this, expect the unexpected when it comes to the Big 12.
Yeah, Utah is 1-3 in conference play now after expecting to win the Big 12 championship. While there is parity, there are 2 teams at the top of this league that have been the exception to that, BYU and Iowa State, by winning every game they played this year. That is a key thing to build the conference's brand. Coming up, is BYU the best new addition of those 8 to the Big 12? Let's talk about it on a Locked On Big 12, Locked On Cougars podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's show is brought to you by FanDuel. Sometimes I go to FanDuel and say, man, what are we doing? BYU is only a 2-point favorite against UCF on the road. I don't want to jinx it, but I do want to add a little extra money to my pocket because I think that BYU is going to win this game. Analytics tell me BYU is going to win this game. Hopefully, BYU wins this game. NFL fans, college football fans, you can start the season with a big return on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. When you get a hunch in the middle of a game, too, there's live betting. Check the live stats, play-by-play, so much more on the same page you place your bets. You get started with $200 in bonus bets, guaranteed when you place a $5 bet. That's right. You don't have to win it. Just place your first $5 bet. Get $200 in bonus bets, guaranteed. FanDuel.com. If you got a hunch like I do that BYU will beat UCF, FanDuel.com is the place to go. That is America's #1 sportsbook, FanDuel.com. Visit them today. Jake Hatch of Locked On Cougs. Again, I'll keep it broad. It's BYU, the best new addition of the 8 to the Big 12.
If you want, in terms of overall athletic department prowess, I would say so. Here's the thing. BYU's got a very competitive football team right now. Their men's basketball team appears to have taken a step forward after losing their head coach, which is incredible. We'll see how it obviously plays out on the court this winter. But the bigger thing is you look at the other sports, women's soccer, the volleyball program on the women's side of things. They've got so many sports for BYU that are competing at a very, very high level in the Big 12. And we're competing from day one, cross country, track and field, on down the list. It's been really, really fun to watch all this unfold. And there was some question, okay, BYU's been competing at an elite level in the leagues they've been in before they jumped into the Big 12. I was curious to see how all of these sports would compete. There were some I already knew were going to be at a disadvantage, baseball and softball in particular, but there were ones that were competing at a national level. We're talking about a women's soccer team that went to a College Cup final and had a chance to win a national championship. I wondered how they'd stack up on a game in and game out basis. Well, it's fit right in. So yeah, I do think BYU in terms of an overall athletic department level, they are the most balanced and I think, yes, the best addition to the league.
Is there any way, before we get into the other 7 and talk even Arizona or Utah or UCF and what they brought to this conference, is there any way to explain how BYU has done what it's done in both basketball last year and football this year?
I think the biggest thing is the fact that BYU needed to have that Power 4 label next to their name. When that happened, BYU had talked for years when they went out and recruited guys both in basketball and football that they were, I use the term Power 5 adjacent, and they were like, hey, we're playing at a Power 5 level schedule, but there were athletes who were like, well, you're not Power 5. You don't have that label next to your name. Well, as soon as they join the Big 12, all of a sudden, like, no, we are. It's now the Power 4, but we are Power 4 caliber, and we are. Remember that. It's changed the recruiting dynamic. Just look at what Kevin Young is doing for BYU on the recruiting front. If he lands AJ DeBonsa, Drake, I'm telling you, that is the biggest recruiting win in BYU sports history, bar none. And people will tell you right now, they're the favorite to land him, which is boggles my mind because as a guy who, like I said, tracks this team literally on a daily basis, it's just still baffling to me that they can pull that off. But that's just not the only name out there. The best part is BYU football is seeing an uptick in their recruiting. Basketball is recruiting at an elite level. So yeah, it's been the fact that they now have that Power 4 label officially affixed to their name, and it's really helping them get indoors. They would have otherwise been like, that's cute, but we'll look at other options.
See, Jake, I want to agree with you, and I do. But I also want to get a clear point of clarification. Yeah. How did it happen so fast? How do you pull? Because UCF would say the same thing. Yeah. Hey, we're in Orlando. We have the Florida recruiting base. Yeah. Give us a year or two of Power 5 status. We'll be there. BYU did it instantly. How did it happen so quickly?
Here's the deal. There's a guy I work with in sports radio here in Salt Lake City who says that BYU will always be able to recruit guys they literally have no business recruiting. And it's because of the affiliation BYU has with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And it has worldwide exposure, obviously. Yep. And it also, there are guys who are elite level athletes who are members of the faith that wanted to play at an elite level of the sport that they choose, whether it's football or basketball. And when BYU wasn't at that level, they're like, okay, maybe I'll check out Utah instead, or I'll look at USC, etc. Well, now that BYU is competing at that level, they're giving a renewed focus of what BYU can offer to them. And the other thing about it is BYU is invested as well. I will say this about their athletic department. They have put money where their mouth is. And I really appreciate that because for years, Drake, the whole moniker around BYU was we do more with less. Right. You know what? How about you do more with more? I said that all the time. Well, guess what? They finally, I think, have flipped that mindset. I think that the leadership at the top of the university is sports minded, and they are investing at an unprecedented level from what I understand. And that's going to pay dividends for BYU in the right now and also on into the future.
If someone argues, hey, Arizona basketball has been so good, or Utah football has won 2 Pac-12 championships, or UCF has been a perennial powerhouse at the mid-level, at the mid-major level in football, then where Cincinnati basketball, you can kind of pick of any of the new teams, their one thing they're very good at, or Deion Sanders for Colorado. Where does BYU say, hey, without a doubt, we're ahead of that piece of your university?
Well, are you talking like in terms of which one they would opt to point out? I'm just trying to get a point.
Yeah. For Arizona, they would hang their hat on basketball. They would say, we're so good at basketball, we bring that much more to the Big 12 than BYU. And UCF would say recruiting base in Florida. Utah would say football success recently. How does BYU justify being better than the other 7?
the fact that they have a national championship in football and they have literally a fan base that will follow them wherever they go. They bring thousands of people with them wherever they go on the road. Their football tradition for BYU is really unique because for the first 50 years of their football history, it was crap. It was awful. LaVell Edwards comes in 1972, and in the 52 years since then, a national championship, Heisman Trophy, Doak Walker Awards, Davey O'Brien trophies, conference titles, legendary games across the board, upsetting number one teams left, right. And it's a history that is unprecedented in many respects. And BYU, they affix themselves to that. I know that BYU men's basketball is having a really nice run right now with Kevin Young doing what he's doing, but the history suggests that BYU will always point to the tradition of their football and say we are a football school first and foremost.
Jake, BYU being the best Big 12 edition. In 5 years, will we look ahead and say not only were they the best Big 12 edition, but they're the strongest athletic department in this conference?
I would hope so, because BYU, like I said, has been investing in this, and they're not going to do it at the expense of overspending because the thing is, the university itself does not lend money to BYU athletics. It is a self-sustaining model. They have to eat what they kill, and that's the thing is BYU is seeing more money pour into their coffers athletically than they've literally ever seen in their history. That is going to allow them to do, as I said, more with more, and that will see them continue to invest in the different areas they feel like they are deficient in. And I'm hopeful that in 5 years, BYU is competing amongst the top of the Big 12 with strategic investment, obviously paying off the way it should. Obviously, it's a crapshoot because it is an investment for a reason, Drake. We all know this. Sometimes investments go belly up, but I do think BYU is smart in how they go about investing that money. And if it goes according to plan, they will be an elite athletic department in the league.
Jake, from Spain to the Philippines to Canada to Mexico to Provo, Utah, there are so many BYU fans worldwide due specifically to that affiliation with the LDS faith. That has been massive in BYU's growth internationally and now in the Big 12, being able to compete at the top level. For you, Jake, where can people who are just listening to you for the first time here on Locked On Big 12 or Locked On Cougs, their first day, find more of your work?
Yeah, so if you want my own thoughts on all things sports, follow me, Jacob C. Hatch. If you're watching it on YouTube, you can see the handle right there. But Locked On BYU, aka Locked On Cougars, available wherever you get your podcasts, just like Locked On Big 12, also available on YouTube. And the show is also on social media. Locked On Cougars on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter/X. Search us out. Let's chat. Let's have some fun. We also have our Locked On Cougars Insider Group. If you want the inside scoop on all things BYU, join us there. It's a really fun time having one-on-one conversations with Cougar fans. As you mentioned, Drake, literally worldwide. I'm having some conversations with folks in the Philippines and the like. It's really fun to have that as an element.
I love it. That's the beauty of the Locked On Podcast Network, not just BYU, but this entire network being able to connect with fans across the world. This has been and always will be Locked On. Come back tomorrow for even more football as BYU is undefeated and should be in the top 10. This has been and always will be Locked On. Thanks for making it your first listen every single day. Cougars, and Dose Grande.